Now, I'm sure that most of you know the old story about the astronaut who went far out into space and was asked on his return whether he had been to heaven and seen God. And he said yes. And so they said to him, well, what about God? And he said, she is black. And although this is a very well-known and well-worn story, it is very profound.
Well, the Bible begins with, in the beginning, God. And the Bible says twice in the Psalms, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. But why are there so many agnostics and atheists if God's existence is so evident? There may be many explanations, but there are certain arguments consistently raised by skeptics which call into question God's existence. Coming up, we'll discuss atheism and the case against God with atheist George Smith and Christian apologist Greg Brahnsen.
Because, I tell you, I knew a monk who started out in life as pretty much of an agnostic or an atheist.
One gets asked, you get asked, if you're me, by believers, well, how come there's something and not nothing? It's a very good question. It's actually a very important question. It's asked from the point of view of something.
My guest, George Smith, has written 2 books. One is entitled Atheism, the Case Against God. The other, Atheism, Ayn Rand, and Other Heresies. And George first published Atheism, the Case Against God in 1974. The book is still in print, published by, I think it's Prometheus. That actually is Prometheus. And then for 6 years, he was a general editor and scriptwriter for the Audio Classics, audio tapes by Knowledge Products. Currently senior research fellow for the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. And again, his latest book, Atheism, Ayn Rand, and Other Heresies. George Smith, we welcome you to the program.
Thank you.
And then he began to read Henri Bergson, the French philosopher who proclaimed the vital force, the élan vital, and so on. And the more he read into this kind of philosophy, the more he saw these people were really talking about God.
I'm going to get a little closer to the mic there, George. Also, we have Dr. Greg Brahnsen, presently scholar in residence at the Southern California Center for Christian Studies, an author of 5 books and nearly 100 journal or periodical articles in Christian apologetics, ethics, and theology. His doctorate is in philosophy, the area of knowledge or epistemology from the University of Southern California, and he has degrees from Westminster Theological Seminary. And Dr. Greg Brahnsen, we welcome you as well.
Thanks, John. Good to be here.
From the point of view of the only species we know of anywhere that could ask that question, it looks out onto vast expanses of nothingness, where nothing is happening and where there is no life. So it is, you have to make the assumption that you are there and that you're able, so you know how all that goes. It rather alters the question when it's being asked in that way, but still it's a good question, but it doesn't have any very helpful answers, or not if you consider, for example,
that, and I've read a great deal of theological reasoning about the existence of God, and they all start out on this line: if you are intelligent and reasonable.
Well, let's start with George Smith. The status quo is existence of God. Most people would believe in that, so since you are sort of opting to challenge the status quo, let's start with...
You cannot be the product of a mechanical and meaningless universe.
Your background, George, in the case against God. Give us your background. You know, why don't you believe there is a God?
From this distant vantage point, the Earth might not seem of any particular interest. But for us, it's different.
Figs do not grow on thistles. Grapes do not grow on thorns. And therefore, you, as an expression of the universe, as an aperture through which the universe is observing itself, cannot be a mere fluke.
Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam.
Because if this world peoples, as a tree brings forth fruit, then the universe itself, the energy which underlies it, what it's all about.
Edwin Hubble was the first to notice that Newton was wrong and that the universe is not just expanding away from itself, the so-called red light shift, at a terrific speed, but you would expect this speed in Newtonian terms to be the rate of its expansion, I mean to say, velocity, to be declining. To the contrary, Hubble noticed it's speeding up, it's getting faster all the time.
The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, are challenged by this point of pale light.
All subsequent experiments have shown this. In fact, if we hadn't discovered the Big Bang when we did, and we were trying for it now, examining the red light, some of that evidence would already have blown past us. If you can get your mind around this, as around Sir Martin Rees's imagery of our cosmic future.
Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves.
As Professor Haldane used to say, the universe is not just stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we can imagine. But we know this much, that it's blasting apart very, very fast. A great deal of nothingness is certainly coming to us.
Well, first of all, let's be clear about what the definition of atheism is, as used by most atheists. Atheism is simply the absence or lack of belief in a God. So if to the question, do you believe in a God, you answer no, that makes you an atheist. I don't believe in a God primarily because I don't see any good reason why I should. In other words, the burden of proof in my mind clearly falls on the theist or the God believer, first to define what he's talking about when he uses the term God, and secondly, then to provide arguments or proof of some kind that such a being exists.
And what type of proof are we talking about? Apodictic certainty? Talking about the preponderance of evidence? What would you accept as sufficient proof to have you change your point of view?
Well, it depends on the kind of being that is defined. I mean,
it died since Friday. It was in a mortuary. This is a brother. And this is the landlord. And you, who are you? Family members?
It's the mother of the wife.
Come here. This is the wife.
Yes, this is the wife.
Come here. This is the wife. Okay.
It seems to me we require stronger evidence of proof of certain things than we do others, especially when something is so out of our context of ordinary experience.
Jesus. Celebrate Jesus.
We glorify
Celebrate Jesus.
Jesus.
Hello, Elliot. Elliot.
Jesus.
For example, it seems to me that if someone claims to have seen a man rise from the dead,
Rise up. Yes. Come on.
Come on. Hey. Jesus.
we're going to require a fairly strong degree of proof to accept that assertion. I think the problem, though, with theists, as I have encountered them, is not in the area of proof. It's that they stumble at the first requirement, which is providing some kind of coherent description, if not a definition, of what kind of being they have in mind when they describe God. A description is not utterly unintelligible, or at least is not contradictory. And that's the problem I have. In many cases, when I ask people, what do you mean by God, I don't get any answer that makes much sense to me. They might as well say, I believe in a blark. It's a nonsense word in that sense, in my mind.
George, when we talk about your working definition that you don't see any evidence for God or sufficient evidence for God, I mean there are shades of definitions here of agnostic and atheist. So you're just using loosely the term atheist to describe those that have never seen enough evidence for God.
Who simply do not believe in a God. And I, admittedly, since I'm using the term God, I should provide at least a rough estimate of what I mean when I use the term.
The ground of being, as Paul Tillich called it, must be intelligent.
Now, is this part of a plan? You certainly have to ask yourself. Is that part of a plan? If so, whose plan is it?
Now, when you come to that conclusion, you must be very careful, because you may make an unwarranted jump.
There's an enormous amount of nothingness in our future. And even if we aren't prepared to wait for that, or to wait for species change to overtake us, we can see already in the night sky the Andromeda galaxy on collision course with our own.
The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit? Yes. Settle? Not yet.
That's certainly...
Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand.
Whether we destroy ourselves or the sun blows up or not before that, probably not. Collision course.
Namely, the jump to the conclusion that that intelligence, that marvelous designing power which produces all this, is the biblical God. Be careful.
But apparently by your presence here, you're open to discuss it as if enough evidence were adduced, you would be willing to modify your perspective.
Especially this should happen in the United States, where it happens that we are a republic and not a monarchy. And if you, as a loyal citizen of this country, think that a republic is the best form of government, you can hardly believe that the universe is a monarchy.
Yeah, and I've been asked before the question, what would it take to convince me? Well, not to be too flippant about it, but I suppose that if a Monty Python-like manner, the clouds were to open and a giant hand were to come down from the clouds and grab me by the scruff of the neck and shake me and say, I'm here.
That would do it for most people.
Yeah, that would get me thinking.
Because that God, contrary to his own commandments, is fashioned in the graven image.
Arthur, King of the Britons.
Of a paternal, authoritarian...
Oh, don't grovel. One thing I can't stand, it's people groveling.
Beneficent tyrant.
Sorry. And don't apologize. Every time I try to talk to someone, it's sorry this and forgive me that and I'm not worthy.
Of the ancient Near East.
What are you doing now?
I'm averting my eyes, O Lord.
Well, don't. It's like those miserable psalms. They're so depressing. Now knock it off.
Yes, Lord.
Right.
It's very easy to fall into that trap, because it's all prepared, institutionalized in the Roman Catholic Church, in the synagogue, in the Protestant churches, all there ready for you to accept. And by the pressure of social consensus and so on, it is very natural to assume that when somebody uses the word God, it is that father figure which is intended.
A God, for me, generally speaking, has to be some kind of a supernatural, or if you like, transcendent being.
Because even Jesus used the analogy, the Father, for his experience of God. He had to. There was no other one available to him in his culture.
In my mind, I'd reject any naturalistic concept of God. In other words, if somebody says to me, I believe that nature is God, I say, fine, but why call it God? Why not just call it nature? So at least the minimum requirement has to be that it's some kind of being that transcends or falls outside the natural context of the nature, falls outside natural law. So a God presumably can perform miracles, do things that natural creatures cannot.